Anyone else? Yes, to the back.
Hello, my name is Mary McNulty from the Coswan Group. I'm not sure what I want to say is an observation and a comment on what's happened this afternoon. I think the practical examples of trying to achieve a republic with human rights and social justice is being actually discussed at the minute. And what I was kind of thinking, listening to each of the presentations, was this notion of being homeless, being an asylum seeker, being a traveller, you know, being on the margins, dispossessed in this country at the time. And it kind of made me think about the metaphor of being an internally displaced person, IDP. I suppose I've worked in that area for a bit, and I kind of became aware at one stage, actually, I'm an IDP also because of, you know, the troubles in Northern Ireland and something. I became really aware of the mental and physical illness that being a displaced person produces, and also the basic need for a home, the basic need for safety, the basic need for, that very basic need, and what the results are if you don't have that need, met. And then I kind of was thinking about a couple of years back, I was involved in a project that was looking at housing in Germany and Belfast, Berlin and Belfast. Now, I'm not sure if it's only Berlin or if it's all of Germany, but there 70% of people live in social housing. And for us that was kind of amazing, because we look at social housing, you know, for those people out there, you know, on the margins. And in Berlin what people did was so imaginative about how to live together, and people getting together and being participative in working out ways of living together that was about ethnicity, class and all of that. So it was a great eye-opener, you know, beginning to see about having some imagination about housing and the need for housing. And the need to do it differently. And that one thing I think about, thinking about social housing, and then beginning to question us, why do we always need a house, a bigger house, you know, how it is in our society, the British Isles, I mean by that. So I don't know whether that's a question or just something about like imagination around homelessness and Yes, last speaker.
I just wanted really to make a comment about the housing situation. I think one of the issues is that we call it social housing. If we call it publicly funded housing, it sounds slightly different, but social housing makes everyone think everyone in there is on social welfare. Now they do, even though they know people who are not there, but they do think that. So I think we have to change our language. The second thing is to go back to what we were talking about the state's ideological absolute opposition to building in the last 10 years, longer actually, since the 1970s. And what they're doing now, it seems to us anyway, is places like O'Devany Gardens, Michael's estate, the state is offering the developers state land. And once they offer them state land, it'll never come back into the state's coffers. So the state is privatizing public land. And I think we have to take that on as a very significant issue.
Very important.
Okay, I'm going to ask the three speakers, Fiona first, to give their final comments for the end of this session and to answer some of those points.
Thanks very much. And thanks for your comments. I noticed, this is the first time I've been to one of these meetings, but I noticed there's a lot of agreement in the room, and you know, different points and, you know, good points being made by everyone, but like nothing that I would disagree hugely with. On the point about, you know, empowering people to do things for themselves, definitely I agree, and I think there are a lot more expert than me who are doing that. There is a lot of groups in community development and so on, empowering people to take control over their own destinies. And one of the speakers from the floor mentioned, you know, bringing I think that was a really good initiative, bringing voting cards into the prisons, because I mean that's the way people basically can have a say over their own destinies, is through voting. The one thing that I possibly would disagree with is the difference between private and public health care. There is a difference, but often the best care that you get is when there isn't, when the practitioner isn't necessarily trying to get pharmaceuticals, drugs sold. So you might get a different tablet, but the generic one, I would prefer to go to the public funded medical person and indeed hospital care. So I don't think once you get access to health care, then you'll get good health care, but it's the access that there are barriers to in terms of addresses and homelessness. I think you know, someone mentioned, I think it was David, about crisis, you know, and there is a lot of crisis, and there's definitely a lot of crisis in terms of health and homelessness, and you can get caught up in the crisis in terms of what do we do now when people are there living in these conditions and suffering like that, and that crisis is about service provision at that point. But it's like the analogy about, you know, what you do when you go to a river. If there's the story about the river and people are drowning in the river, and you spend your time pulling them out of the river, somebody has to go upstream and see where they're falling in and prevent them from falling in. When I'm talking about you know, preventing poor health in the homeless population, and preventing inequities, and the answers being, you know, more in the domain of the social determinants of health. That is upstream, preventing the people from falling in. Obviously when they're in, then you need the appropriate care, which we don't have anyway. We are advocating for proper mental health services for homeless people because it is a crisis, but they have to be prevented falling in. Thank you very much.
Yeah, again, just some general comments or response, and I suppose it's been said. I mean, again, I'm not sure of the question about sort of the access or distinction between the health service. Clearly we have a two-tier system in terms of how you get into it to begin with, in terms of whether you're on insurance or whether you have no insurance or Medicare. But I certainly never thought of the distinction once you're in the system. And again, from my own experience of family members who are working within the system and also in patients, I've never come across a situation. I would be very concerned if there was proof of different drug treatments effectively for public patients and private patients. I mean, there's clearly obviously in terms of labelled medicines, but the quality of what people deliver or get within the public system, I would have thought is from a very high standard, certainly my own experience of the system. So I don't think it's worth always being negative and constantly knocking something. It sounds quite serious to make an allegation that, you know, those in the public system are somehow being treated different drugs or quality of drugs. I don't think that's the case, and I don't necessarily accept that. Yeah, I mean, again, I use the term. Again, I'm a little bit concerned about like terminology of changing things to suit, because some people's ideology doesn't like what we have. I mean, I use the term deliberately council housing because that's what the council were good at. They built council housing. You know, whether we call it social housing or whether we call it public funded housing, I mean, the reality of every house in this country since 2008, they are publicly funded. You know, mortgaged housing, private ownership, you know, the fact that we've put such massive amounts of public money into subsidising our banks that keep up the private market. Every house in the country is now publicly funded, and let's not forget that. But, you know, I call it what it is. It's council housing. Let's get back to building what they did and what they could do. And somebody made a point in the 60s and 70s when there was less money and less availability of resources. That's what they did, and they did a reasonably good job. Lots of problems in certain areas. You know, the notion that because somebody perceives that everybody in a social house is on social welfare, let's just change the title to something else. I don't know. So what if they are on social welfare? They need to somewhere to live, and that's the reality of it. I've no other responses to except to say that there's, you know, there was one other comment that did strike me earlier on that I wanted to say something about, but I've not completely forgotten, so we'll deal with that. Thank you very much.
Thanks, just a couple of points. I think I was very interested when Carol referred to human rights being somewhat abstract to people. And it's interesting that the comments that came back from the floor today were about very real issues, you know. And in a way, I was involved in drafting an application to the Human Rights and Equality Commission for some funding for the next stage of the ESC rights crusade, shall we say. And I was kind of writing about that need to bridge the abstract and the real, because the people who go after rights on the ground, even though they may not call them such, are the small community groups and women's groups and travellers groups who are fighting these issues on the ground. So we need to be strategic. I'm a community worker by trade. Community workers are always strategic because they have few resources, they're usually very small groups, they're a small force, and they have to build a big tent. So we'd be used to that. We have a term we use called moving from the real to the ideal, and I think that's what we need to do. I think it's done very well with the Participation and Practice of Rights initiative in Belfast, Desi Donnelly and that, and there's certainly lessons to be learned there. I also think there are tools, or strings, if you like, we could pull, and one, as Nuala says, is the public duty. You know, there's a vulnerability there, or an opportunity there that we could use and should use. Particularly, it's quite well written actually, and it does mention in particular local authorities, which are a pet target of mine. Just in terms of the housing issue, I think that's really interesting, because social housing comprising 70%, was it, in Germany, it shows you the difference between can't and won't, you know, because you can provide that amount of social housing, and the state can be very proactive in social housing and in any housing. But I think it's really the ideological battle here that we have to win. And it's gone on all over the place, the whole privatisation of land, as somebody spoke about, and the privatisation of everything, even the 999 service is privatised. I live in a village where the traffic lights at each side of the village, and both of them were privatised. One was put in by Lidl and the other by Super Value. And of course the bias towards the customers going in and out rather than the public good. So it's all pervasive. But as I say, the most important thing I think is to try and bridge the abstract. And there are really, really good people in the law profession who are anxious to help but wouldn't understand the stuff on the ground. And there are people on the ground who need to, particularly in this time where concepts like community development and that have lost their currency or have been robbed of their currency. I think they need to move to the rights quest and to begin to bridge those two worlds, and I think that'll be useful. Thank you.
I just want to thank everybody for their contributions, and particularly to our three speakers. And just to say, you know, I think that we've had a lot of very much the meat in the sandwich this afternoon, talking about the real application of human rights and equality. One thing that Nuala raised the issue of public duty, and in terms of what the Human Rights Equality Commission is doing, is we are prioritising that work and doing a lot with pilot schemes with local councils on issues like housing. But I do think that the difficulty that we're all facing, both as activists and as people